morning. I was saying to Mark Richards yesterday afternoon that this is a slightly unusual talk for me to have to give. I guess it is an unusual talk for you to receive here at the Grace Assembly. I normally give two types of talks. I preach in our church and other evangelical churches, and I won't use PowerPoint. I will preach in the usual way, and I will just preach freely, God, by his grace, helping me from the scriptures. And I won't, and when I preach away especially, I ask that I not be introduced as a doctor or a professor, because I'm there as a Lord's servant and an elder in our church. But then on other occasions, of course, in relation to my academic work, I give talks around this country and around the world on aspects of depression and dementia, which are my two major specialist research areas. And in those situations, then I do use PowerPoint, and I am, of course, introduced as a doctor and a professor and so on. And I wasn't quite sure what kind of talk I was supposed to be doing here today. But in the end, I've decided I will use PowerPoint. But of course, we're reading the Bible as well. So it's a sort of hybrid talk that I am delivering to you this morning. So, mad, sad, or bad? I think it was changed to mad, bad, sad on the title that was printed out for you. And in fact, it was cut down in a way that I was rather disappointed about from my full title that I'd given to the steering committee, Reflections on Sin, Personal Responsibility and Mental Disorders. I suppose that is a bit of a mouthful and took up too much space on the programme. But that then is what I would like to start off with this morning. Then our second talk, I've been asked to speak more specifically and focus then on depression. I was happy for John to introduce me this morning. I've known John on and off for some years, and in the past have preached at Murfield Evangelical Church. But John is an odd chap, isn't he? He has some unusual beliefs, some beliefs that raise concerns. John, for example, believes that I'm a bad man. In fact, a very bad man. Such a bad man that I deserve to be punished for all my badness. I deserve, in fact, to be punished in hell forever and ever. And this is a very concerning belief that John has, isn't it? And then again, I gather that John believes that God talks to him and tells him what to do, and that he lives his life by what he believes God tells him. That sounds a bit worrying as well. And he also, I gather, engages in some dodgy rituals involving eating flesh, drinking blood. And so I've wondered whether maybe John really needs a proper psychiatric evaluation. And I thought that John might not be too keen on the idea of a psychiatric evaluation, but then as a consultant psychiatrist, I'm empowered by the Secretary of State for Health to section people. And so I brought along a pink form, which I can complete. But John, you'd be relieved to know that actually on my own, I don't quite have the power. I think there might be another doctor, as John Hall, in the room. If he was here, he might be able to help me, John, and get you sectioned and taken away for a proper psychiatric evaluation. But more seriously then, there are only two categories of people whom we lock up, aren't there? Two categories of people whom the state in our country and generally in other countries locks up: the mentally ill and the criminals. So you will have to commit a crime to be incarcerated, or you are afflicted with a mental illness that is severe enough and disturbing enough to force people like me to section you and take you into a psychiatric unit. You have to be bad to commit crimes, to be locked up, or you have to be mad or sad enough to be sectioned and locked up. And as I say, this isn't true just in our country, but in other countries around the world. So there are these interrelationships between madness, sadness, and badness. More obviously, people who are bad can get mental illnesses themselves. And of course, people with mental illnesses do bad things. And sometimes when they do bad things, they may indeed be locked up. They may be imprisoned. But on other occasions, they will be deemed not responsible for those crimes or those sins. And it's that area that I think causes some discomfort among Christian people, that people with mental illness can be excused for their bad behavior. So take Mary, member of your church for some years, but she's become gloomy, withdrawn. She's stopped attending church. She used to help with the cleaning, but doesn't do that anymore. And her husband John has come to you and as the pastor, and he said, look, could you come and visit and help, please, because I'm struggling with this. And you visit and you find that she's become quite irritable, and she's shouting at her husband, and she's being offhand and bullying towards her children. And you speak with her, and you pastor her from the scriptures, and you pray with her, and you go away, and then the next week you come back, and John says, well, that's actually Mary doesn't want to see you again because she's been to see her GP, and her GP said she's got depression, and he's put her on the antidepressant sertraline, and he's arranged for some special counselling, and so she doesn't need you now. Is she ill? Is she bad? Or Frank then, his memories become worse and worse, and he's now been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and you and his wife have watched him decline with this. His wife dies, and you watch him decline further. And then his daughter contacts you to say she wants to speak to you privately about a rather difficult and embarrassing situation. And you meet with her, and she says how he's begun to speak rudely, lewdly to her, and to make sexual advances to her, and to fondle her and molest her. And she doesn't know what to do. Is he mad? Is he bad? Well, to address these and I think other important questions, we need to step back and to reflect on what we mean by these categories of sin and personal responsibility and mental illness. One of the annoying things that I find in reading some Christian literature is the failure so often of people to define and explain what they're actually talking about. So you read books on legalism and antinomianism, and these people, they don't tell you what they actually mean by these terms. Or you read books on the covenant of grace and law and so on, and people fail to actually explain properly what you're talking about, and it's just so annoying, isn't it? You think, oh, can't you explain what you're talking about? So I want to begin by explaining what we're talking about with these categories. Sin, I hope, won't take much explaining in this context. Sin, we're not talking about any kind of badness, any kind of evil, are we? As Berkhoff says, it's possible to speak not only of sin, but also of sickness as an evil. But then, of course, the word evil is used in two totally different senses. We're talking about moral evil. We're talking about transgression of the law of God, aren't we? As Grudem says, we're talking about sin as any failure to conform to the moral law of God in act, attitude, or nature. In our thoughts, in our words, in our deeds, we transgress God's laws, and this is what we mean by sin. I don't think in this context I need to delve any more into that. And then personal responsibility. We've read that passage from Ezekiel, one of the Bible's clear statements that each of us is accountable to God for our behavior. He is pleased with our good deeds. He is angry and punishes us for our bad deeds. We are personally responsible to him for how we conduct our lives before him. And we will return to that as we come towards the end to focus specifically on personal responsibility in the context of mental illness. But of course, I want to spend much more time then thinking, what do we mean by mental illness? So what is illness? Illness I'll use interchangeably with sickness, but you will generally use the term illness. So we're talking about something subjective, my experience. Disease is objective. Disease leads to some damage to individuals, damage to us psychosomatically, to our bodies, to our minds. We're damaged. There is pathobiology. There's identifiable damage, or potentially identifiable damage. And doctors recognize the presence of the disease by clinical syndromes, by the presence of clinical signs and symptoms. So somebody with Parkinson's disease manifests it through a slow tremor, through slowness of movement, through stiffness in their muscles, and various other features, and you can do special brain scans and things as well. And these signs and symptoms, the investigations of the clinical syndrome that will be defined. Or stroke disease, there is damage to the brain. You can see it in brain imaging, and you look for that. The damage leads to dysfunction, maybe loss of sensation, more commonly loss of movement in a limb or more than one limb, or in the face or in the speech and so on. It's a stroke. It has to last more than 24 hours. It's defined in these ways, signs and symptoms. And it's the same then with mental illness, clusters of signs and symptoms. But the key difference is that many of these signs and symptoms are mental, of course. They are to do with our thinking and our feelings, as well as our outward actions or behavior. But schizophrenia then is defined in terms of as a clinical syndrome where there are certain types of delusional beliefs and hallucinations and disorders in people's thoughts and so on. There is an underlying pathobiology, a disease that manifests in this clinical syndrome. But then we can define other behavioral syndromes. So we could define a clinical syndrome, or not a clinical syndrome, a syndrome of Anglicanism, or of Reformed baptism, to show I'm a balanced speaker, or Presbyterianism, or in the political realm of Thatcherism and so on. Because we could identify people as an Anglican who would have the features of Anglicanism by his beliefs, by his liturgical behaviors, by the wider way in which he lives. A behavioral syndrome of Anglicanism, or as I say, of Reformed baptism. The same for political syndromes. We can identify individuals, can't we, who adhere to certain lifestyles and convictions. So why isn't Anglicanism a disease and a syndrome? Or why isn't Reformed baptism a disease and a syndrome? What makes the difference between these things and schizophrenia or dementia? Well, the answer's to do with choice, isn't it? You choose to be an Anglican or a Reformed Baptist or a Corbynite. But you don't choose to have schizophrenia. You don't wake up one morning and say, I think I'll have Parkinson's disease today. Illnesses, your experience of a particular disease, they happen to you. You don't choose them. They impact on you. They're objective phenomena that affect you. They weren't your chosen lifestyle. They're not your chosen behavior. This is a very important point about how, of course, we get ill. We get afflicted, something happens to us, it makes us ill. It wasn't our choice. So here is a definition of mental illness, rather wordy, I'm afraid. And there are four main elements to it. First of all, then, that it is a behavioral syndrome, as I've just been describing, this collection of signs and symptoms. But then, as I say, it results from some objective cause or causes. These may be internal due to genetic faults, changes in molecules, damage to cells, and so on. They may be external through traumatic injury or infections and so on, but something happens to you objectively and that damages you. You have a disease, you then have the clinical syndrome that you experience as your illness. And these things that happen to you can be physical or psychological. And then these things produce clinically significant impairments in everyday functioning. And these things then are usually in psychiatric definitions defined as also then not including political, religious, and certain sexual behaviours. Now, this is a slightly arbitrary element and indeed actually an unnecessary element. But the reason it's included is that modern psychiatry has dropped the second point. That is, it has removed the need for objective causation. All you need is a clinical syndrome. You no longer need objective causation. So behavioural syndrome, response to some objective cause, not religious, political, clinically significant impairment in everyday functioning. So I've said then that psychiatry, the definition that you will find in the textbooks today, does not have the need for objective causation, that something happens to you to make you ill. And the result of this is that there has been a great industry, as it were, of creating new mental disorders. Now, significantly, these are not called mental illnesses, because more widely, if you look up historic definitions of illness and illness outside psychiatry, then it always includes objective causation. Illness needs that. So psychiatrists are a bit embarrassed about not calling things illnesses, and so tend to speak of mental or psychiatric disorders. And so all sorts of disorders are in the psychiatric diagnostic manuals, such as the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from the American Psychiatric Association, which is the major one used throughout the world. And in the British Medical Journal a few years ago, then this was a question posed, and I use this every year when I'm teaching young trainees in psychiatry about diagnosis. And I say, now, which one of these then is not a mental disorder? And I know some of you have read the book, and this is in my book. Don't shout out the answer. But that means that 4 of these are listed as mental disorders, okay? Now, when I ask this year by year to the training psychiatrists, I haven't detected anything other than randomness in the answers to the questions here. Nobody can detect that, in fact, it's motivational deficiency disorder, which is a fiction. It was created purely for this survey. So this was a survey sent out to doctors and health professionals saying, can you guess which one of these isn't a mental disorder? And they didn't do very well either, as it were. And I don't blame them. I don't blame them. I've never diagnosed any of these, okay? But they are all diagnoses in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And they're allowed to be diagnoses because you don't have to have causation. All you have to do is describe a syndrome, which could be reformed baptism as much as anything, and then, of course, believe that, or the person has to believe that this is a bad thing to have. It leads to dysfunction or impairment in your living. Hang on. So I better come back to him in a minute. Sorry. So I've forgotten what my next slide was. So I'll tantalize you with that flash of the president. So you can invent, as they did in that survey, all sorts of disorders. So a couple of weeks ago, in the news, there was talk of sex addiction, wasn't there? And you could just invent sex addiction disorder. Because you'd say, well, there are these people who are troubled by this problem, and you would just define the mental and the behavioral features of it. Or you could have hijacking disorder. and you would just invent syndromes of terrorists who wanted to hijack aeroplanes or trains or whatever. You could just make these up. And indeed, that essentially is what's happened. That there are all sorts of conditions like pyromania, which means fire setting, repeat fire setting. Or kleptomania is in the diagnostic manual as well, repeated impulsive stealing of objects. These are all potential diagnoses. Now, jobbing psychiatrists, ordinary psychiatrists never use any of these diagnoses. But they're in there, in the diagnostic manual, as available options. And they're only available because the need for causation, which is what we call proper illness, isn't a requirement. You don't have to have that. So all you have to have then is this behavioral syndrome. Now I can move to my next slide. So a colleague said to me a couple of years ago, she said, you know, Alan, it used to be quite difficult to teach medical students and junior doctors what narcissism meant. But Donald Trump has made it really easy, because all you need to do is say, Donald Trump is a prime example of a narcissist. Now, of course, Donald Trump doesn't actually have a personality disorder, because personality disorder requires you to have dysfunction. And he's been highly successful as a businessman and now in politics, so it's difficult to define Donald Trump as having had enough problems, enough dysfunction to say that he would be narcissistic personality disorder, but he does have grandiose sense of self-importance. I think he is preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success. He certainly believes he's special, as evidenced by his repeated firing of his staff, because he's so sensitive to anyone who disagrees with him or criticism, because he's this ongoing requirement for excessive admiration, that people have to fawn and grovel to him, and if they don't, they're out in their ear, and so on. But he's not ill. He's not mentally ill. He has this unhelpful personality. And then there are other personality disorders. So antisocial personality disorder is what you would probably know as psychopathy, or the psychopath, or psychopathic disorder. And essentially it's a list of criminal and sinful behaviors. And so you would diagnose somebody as having antisocial personality disorder when they do these things. They lie, they steal, they beat people up, and so on. And they say, you know, if somebody says, this is a problem, it's a disorder because it's led to dysfunction. Their marriage is broken up, they can't hold down a job, and so on. This is said to be dysfunctional, and therefore they can be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. So the first problem with definition in modern psychiatry, and where it departs then from proper definitions of illness and proper understanding of illness, is this removal of the need for cause, for objective causation. And that allows the creation of all sorts of diagnostic categories for behaviors which are largely bad, sinful behaviors. They're not illnesses in the proper sense, but they're there as potential psychiatric diagnoses, mental disorders. But the other reason that we have such a large number of people who are said to have mental disorders and mental illnesses in our society and other Western societies is what's called disease inflation. So whereas disease creation of new disorders is allowed by the removal of the need for objective causation, this is a much more important for you to understand. Creation of these new disorders is interesting, and you will have people with these kinds of disorders in your churches. But by and large, the reason lots of people are given diagnoses of mental illnesses or mental disorders is because of disease inflation. So in these categories, then you have real illnesses due to real diseases, but they're grossly enlarged, so that many more people are allowed the diagnosis. And one reason for this is what's called criterion creep. So criterion creep has been reported in different ways. So PTSD is a good example, post-traumatic stress disorder. So post-traumatic stress disorder used to be called Vietnam syndrome. It was first came then out of the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s with veterans then from the war who were damaged psychologically. And there wasn't a diagnostic category at the time available to them. And one of the reasons for the invention of all these diagnostic categories is that you can't receive health care in the United States unless you've got a diagnosis. So that forces the invention of lots of these diagnoses that people, with caffeine addiction, for example, who think that's a problem, they want medical help, they're allowed to have that reimbursed through the health insurance. So in this country, we don't need to kind of apply all these absurd diagnoses because the health service doesn't demand DSM diagnoses, but the US system does. And so they had to invent PTSD in the US in order to allow veterans to have a diagnostic category. And so it came into the manual in 1980, and when it came in, there were 12 symptoms in 3 clusters, giving about 135 potential diagnostic combinations. By DSM-4, in 1984, then it enlarged to 17 symptoms, still 3 clusters, and 1,750 combinations. In the current DSM-5, we now have 4 clusters, 21 symptoms, and 10,500 potential symptom combinations. In other words, if you've experienced trauma, now it's very difficult not to be diagnosed with PTSD if you want to be, or your doctor wants you to be, because you've got so many options. And this is the inflation. So there is a real PTSD. I don't like the term, I think it's a bad term, but there is a real damage to people when they've experienced horrific trauma. But the people who can be diagnosed with this has been hugely increased by this criterion creep. You just broaden the criteria by adding new symptoms and symptom clusters and combinations. So you end up with being able to diagnose lots and lots of people who really shouldn't be diagnosed at all. And so there are lots of this is the case in all sorts of areas. So we have autism, for example. So autism is a horrible condition which some children have. When I was at medical school, we were told it occurs in 1 in 10,000 children. Today, we're told it occurs in 1 in 100. There's a 100-fold increase in a few decades. Not that many decades, but since I was in medical school. Because of this expansion of the diagnostic boundaries, the loosening of the diagnostic criteria, the criterion creepage over the years. And so depression, as we'll consider later on, is of course another example, OCD. These are real illnesses, but where they have been greatly expanded or inflated. So one reason is criterion creep, and another reason is that in order to be ill, you have to have dysfunction. Now, just as I think that the need for causation is common sense. I think if you thought or had thought what you mean by illness, you would understand that you become ill because something happens to you, something damages you. You get a disease. You didn't choose it. I think you'd understand that's at the heart of what illness is. And in the same way, dysfunction is at the heart of common sense understanding of illness, isn't it? If somebody says to you, my wife is sick or my wife is ill, you don't picture her sort of walking around doing things in the normal everyday way, do you? You envisage her as being laid up in bed or sitting down, not able then to function at home because she's sick. Common sense understanding of sickness then is this inability to function normally, this dysfunction, this loss of the ability to carry on your usual activities of daily living. But the problem with dysfunction is, well, what do you mean by dysfunction? How much of a loss of ability to do things counts to make it an illness? And there isn't a clear dividing line then between health or normality and sickness, at which you can say that's where we cross the boundary. Now, this is common in medicine, that the absence of a clear boundary. So easy examples are, for example, diabetes. So diabetes is defined in terms of a blood sugar level above a certain threshold. But if you lower the threshold, lots more people are diagnosed as diabetes. They haven't changed, they don't feel any different. The same with blood pressure or hypertension. There's a threshold, systolic pressure, 140 or 150 or 160 or 170. Various thresholds have been used. And a few years ago, I can't remember if it made the final cut of the book or not, but I referred to an article in which they lowered the threshold for blood pressure to 140, and suddenly hundreds of millions of people in the world now found they had hypertension. And they didn't the day before. It must have been pretty unpleasant, really. But, you know, there's an arbitrary element to some of these boundary areas in diagnosis. And one of the big arbitrary areas is to do with how much dysfunction, how impaired do you have to be ill? Alan Francis is a senior US psychiatrist, and he, in fact, was the head man over the DSM-4. He was a chairman of the whole diagnostic organization that developed that diagnostic manual. And he retired, and since retirement, he's kind of recanted of what he recognizes were all his mistakes with DSM-4 and allowing all these new diagnoses and in loosening the boundaries for diagnosis. So he's written saying that DSM-4 created 3 false epidemics of disorders in children: autism, attention deficit disorder, and childhood bipolar disorder. Now, bipolar disorder, autism, and ADD, these are real illnesses, but he recognizes that they've been hugely inflated because of the change in the criteria and the way you define your boundaries as to what constitutes dysfunction sufficient to make someone ill. And so this is the big problem. How do you define dysfunction? As I say, there is no easy answer. And this isn't then, as I say, a problem that's unique to psychiatry. Other areas of medicine have this kind of boundary problem. And you shift the boundary and you grossly inflate the number of people with the illness. So we have then, if you like, we have mental illness at the middle, proper illness. And then beyond that, we have these created disorders, the impulsive disorders, the personality disorders, there's the pyromania and those kind of things, and narcissism and so on. So you get a lot more people who can be diagnosed. And then you can inflate it further by loosening the criteria and pushing back the boundaries to normality. I forgot to say, Alan Francis, I referred to a book. There's a book he's out, published 2013, you might read, it's very readable, called Saving Normal, in which he writes about how you try and kind of define the boundary and try and get more people back to recognize as normal from being defined as sick. But then the problem's even worse, because in society more generally, you have everything inflated even more. So, you know, doctors, we try to diagnose in some way, even if the boundaries get pushed out. But then in society, of course, you hear on the news all the time people have mental health problems or mental health difficulties. And these aren't really defined at all. And they're sort of lumped in with the mental illness and the mental disorders and so on. And so you have these figures of huge numbers of people who have mental health problems, published figures reporting that 40–50% of adults have mental health problems. So one half of this room, you see, has mental health difficulties, if you believe these figures. And maybe I'll try and guess which half of the room, has the mental health problems. But it isn't all psychiatry's fault then. I think we're aware that we live in a highly pampered society, don't we? We live in a society where people are living longer, living healthier for longer, and therefore fewer illnesses, more effectively treated with very good medication than ever before, and yet more people complaining of being ill than ever before. It's not just psychiatry, it's our society wants diagnoses, wants to be told they're ill. And the British Medical Journal has for years now run a campaign where they flag this issue up from time to time in articles about too much medicine, too many people being diagnosed, fictitious or false diagnoses, not just in psychiatry, but in other areas of medicine. But there are then these pressures within medicine, within society, and from the pharmaceutical industry. Bad Pharma is the title of a book worth reading by a psychiatrist. And it looks at the bad practices, the immoral, the criminal practices of large pharmaceutical companies. Because it's much easier if you're GSK or Roche to say, let's apply my antidepressants to this other group of people with anxiety, than it is to actually spend all the money trying to develop a good new drug to treat schizophrenia. It's far more money in just repurposing or remarketing your existing drugs for new diagnoses. And so pharma are a big force behind the creation of new diagnoses that themselves then allow them to target their drugs at these new diagnoses. So it's not just psychiatry's fault. There's a lot more that could be said about these things, but there are these pressures to create and to inflate diagnoses. Okay, so that's the kind of technical stuff. How can you know whether somebody's mentally ill? Well, I don't think it's difficult to know that someone is ill. Knowing what specific type of illness they have is much harder. And knowing what treatment they have is much harder. But to know that someone is ill isn't difficult. There's a story you may have heard about Ronald Reagan when he was president of the US, and he was visiting the zoo in San Diego. And as he was walking along, with the press following, he passed the cage with the gorillas in it. And so, of course, the press thought it would be a fantastic opportunity. They said, Mr. President, could you just stand there so we could get a picture of you with the gorillas? And, of course, Reagan knew what they were up to. So, but, he was always game. So he said, gamely, walked over and said, yeah, right, here I am. But when you print it, remember to say the president is the one wearing the watch. So, he knew how they were going to use that. Can you tell the difference between Reagan and a gorilla? Can you tell the difference between a sick person and a healthy person? Yes, you can. You don't need a watch, is it? We don't need me, a specialist, to say, there's the person who is mentally ill. You go on to a psychiatric unit, you talk with somebody there, you'll know they're ill. It's not difficult. You might not understand why they're ill or what's going on, but that they're ill, you will know that. So recognizing somebody's ill is straightforward, I think. Now you might say, but Professor, you were just telling us about that boundary problem. And doesn't that mean that you find it difficult sometimes to know whether somebody is ill? Or just on the other side, as it were, of the line, the boundary, and not ill? And yeah, that's true. But when that's the case, of course, they're not actually very ill at all. And when they're not very ill, as we'll see later this morning, then you are as equipped to help them as people in the health service, and as equipped to help them as if they were just the other side of that line that doesn't allow them to be diagnosed as having an illness. But when they're more severely ill, you will know that they're ill. And you are well equipped to help people with mental illness. You're equipped because you know human nature much better than people in the health service. You have the Bible, you know your Bible, you understand the kinds of creatures we are much better than psychiatrists. And you're compassionate people, caring people. And that's really important when you're ministering. I met a psychotherapist a couple of weeks ago involved with a patient, and the thing that most struck me about this particular therapist was how lacking in compassion the therapist actually was. She was machine-like. She had no empathy. And I thought, well, this sort of person has never been allowed to be a therapist. It's got to be fundamental, it's basic, isn't it, to helping suffering people that they know you care, that you genuinely want to help them. And I'm sure that's true of you. And it's really important. And of course, you pastors, senior Christians in churches, you have lots of relevant experience and skills in helping people. And those, if they have sometimes, I'm sure, been with people with mental illness, you will have honed and developed those. And if they've been with other people, they're transferable to helping people with mental illness. And of course, you've got support from the church family. It's not just you as a minister or an elder, is it? Really important that other people in the church are involved in supporting and caring for the mentally ill in your midst. As I say, we'll come back to this much more detail in the next talk, using depression as an example and, if you like, a lens to focus on this. But then also, as I'm pretty sure I do say in the book, there have been lots of research studies that show that people with no training and then very little training, not doctors, not nurses, not therapists, studies done in India and Africa with previously untrained, inexperienced people, that they can provide meaningful help to people with mild mental illnesses. And if such people can provide help, I'm sure you're much more able, for all these reasons, to provide help that is genuinely beneficial to these people with these mild mental illnesses. So we have then, I think, three categories, if you like, for practical purposes for you, for mental disorders. So we have those which aren't mental illnesses at all, the newly created diagnosis. Sometimes not new, of course, like psychopathy has been around a long time, but these are not illnesses. These are bad behaviors. You will have people like this visiting your church. You will have people like this in membership in some of your churches. I know of psychopaths in churches. And then you have those with severe mental illnesses. So we'll come back to this later. But these are essentially those people who need psychiatrists, they need doctors, they need what the NHS provides. They need the specialist treatments, but they also need your support in the usual way that you give to people who are ill. And then thirdly, there are those then who have mild mental illnesses. And I've said then, they really only require your help and the church's help. They don't really need health service help at all. So Mary, is such a person. Mary's not ill. She needs pastoral, not medical care. But of course, like so many people, she went off to a GP who gave her the antidepressant, the sertraline, and so on. And I appreciate that makes it then really difficult for you, doesn't it, to engage her, because she now sees herself as not responsible. I've got depression. I mean, of course I'm going to lose my temper. I'm depressed. That's why I get angry with the children. But as we'll see, she is responsible. And somebody with that kind of mild illness doesn't actually need medical help at all. And in fact, those antidepressants will not benefit her. So then, sorry, time's getting on, move to focus then on personal responsibility. So Andrew Sims was president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists a few years ago. He's a Christian. And he wrote this statement, which I think is important. I think at one level it is obvious, but as he says, it's important. In trying to decide what is and what is not a mental illness, it's useful to consider two different dimensions. For example, contrasting the mentally ill and the mentally healthy, and then an entirely separate and independent dimension is good, bad, right, wrong. That these variables are independent of each other is obvious, but it does need stating. Okay, they're different categories. Sin, mental illness, different categories. Okay. So when we're considering then whether somebody's responsible, we have then that Bible teaching that we considered earlier on and much other teaching in Scripture. And as you know then, throughout the Scriptures, each human being is treated as individually responsible for his or her behavior. That is the default position, isn't it? That's the default position that's laid out very clearly then in Ezekiel 18, where he lays out then those three generations of the iniquitous father, with his immorality, sexual immorality, idolatry, thieving, and so on. And he's guilty, responsible for his wickedness. And then he has a son who's righteous, who's faithful to his wife and helps the poor and needy and so on. And he is responsible for his behavior. But he is a son, the grandson, who in turn then is wicked and idolatrous and so on. These three generations. And of course, these three generations, they share the same environment in Babylon. They share then the same cultural experiences. They have the same teaching and training in that Jewish environment within the wider Babylonian culture. They expose the same sort of upbringing in the same family group. They share the same genes largely. One's bad, another's good. Each responsible for his behavior, and so we see very clearly in that then that genes, a bad genetic load, provides no excuse. That your environment provides no excuse. That your upbringing provides no excuse. Each of us is individually responsible for our behavior. But is that always true? Is that always true? Well, most societies, including our own, would say, no, it's not, of course, always true, that there are people with mental illnesses who are not responsible. In the Bible, I think we have some support, modest support for that in relation to children. So we have those statements in Isaiah chapter 7 about a boy who reaches an age where he is able to refuse the evil and choose the good. The implication being, there was an age before that, it's very young, where he doesn't know right and wrong. Or in John 9, the man born blind, and the parents, stand off and say, don't look at us, go and talk to him. He's of age. He's now of age himself. You can blame him for his behavior, don't blame us. And the implication again, he's now reached an age. Before that, at some earlier point, he wasn't responsible for his behaviour as a child, as I would think a very young child. Because in order to be responsible for bad behaviours, you have to know that it is bad behaviour. You have to have an understanding of right and wrong. In law, you have to have the mens rea, the guilty mind. You don't just do the deed. You have to have the ability to do it knowing or understanding that it's a wrong behaviour. And throughout the world, and in this country, we have not just the Mental Health Act, we have the Mental Capacity Act, which deals with then the impact of illness and damage to the brain and mind on decision-making capacity. And a key point then is that decision-making is not binary. You don't cross a threshold at which you no longer are able to decide things. You're so mentally impaired you can't decide things for yourself. No, it's proportional. It's a sliding scale. So we go from high-level decisions on the left here, so sort of executive decisions by chief executive, or decisions that a consultant like myself would have to make, where they're highly complex. They require a high level of mental functioning, through slightly easier decisions about using your finances or making a will, through to...
We have these lights off. We can't see there's no contrast in the green.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
It's all right. Can people see now? Is it still not very clear?
Thank you.
So we go then from complex decisions which require high levels of mental functioning or high capacity to straightforward decisions. So marriage is regarded as an easy decision. Okay? And it's a fine example because it flags that the decision isn't about the importance of the decision. Of course, we recognize the importance of marriage. It's about the complexity of the decision. And the reason marriage is regarded as not a complex decision is partly because what it involves is fairly straightforward and committing yourself to a man or woman for life. Man to a woman and a woman to a man for life. And with the responsibility that holds and so on. But also that all of us, as we grow up, we're exposed, we meet people who are married all the time. We understand then, we're taught from being very young what marriage involves. So you can be quite impaired and still able to make a proper decision about whether to get married. So people with some mental handicap, which can be quite severe, can decide to get married legitimately, legally, because it's not a difficult decision in terms of capacity. Okay. But moral decisions are the easiest of all, for the same sort of reason that marriage is an easy decision. Because, of course, the scriptures tell us that the law of God is written on the hearts of man, that people know fundamental rights and wrongs, whether Christians or not, and are exposed from a young age to what's right and wrong, at least in broad terms. So that most of what we would regard as sinful behaviours are very much towards the right hand, the low, easy end of the spectrum, where you don't have to have much mental capacity to be able to make the decision. And that leads us to what I've called a kind of good catch-22 situation. And I say it's good because it's good for you to help you know what to do. So Joseph Heller wrote Catch-22. It was a novel in the 20th century. And Professor Thomas is not recommending that you read Catch-22. I read it before I was a Christian. But I remember certain parts of it very well. And I remember the Catch-22 parts. So the Catch-22, so it was set in the Second World War, US Air Force, and the main man, Yossarian, was having to fly aeroplanes in and out of battle zones, which is extremely dangerous, and lots of people were killed. And he didn't want this. He didn't want to have to fly. He wanted to get out. And then he learned that you could get out of flying. There was a way you could get out of flying, and that was if you were crazy, in the politically incorrect language of the book. Okay, if you were crazy, you didn't have to fly. So he thought, right, I'll go off and see the medical officer. So he went to the medical officer and explained that he was crazy and so he shouldn't be flying. And the medical officer said, there's a catch. You see, the only people who want to fly are those who are crazy. All the sane people don't want to fly. So because you've come here telling me you don't want to fly, you must be sane. And therefore you have to fly. And so Yasari and Bemused said, wow, that's some catch. And the medical officer said, yep, catch 22, the best there is. But in terms of capacity then, we have this situation. Moral decisions are the easiest to make. You have to be very damaged, very impaired, very ill mentally, not to be responsible for making moral decisions, to have lost the capacity for such decisions. And if you were sharp enough to think, I don't think I'm responsible for my actions, then by definition, you are responsible. Because to be able to have the capacity to think like that means that you can't be sufficiently impaired to actually have lost capacity. The only people who've lost capacity and are not responsible for their decisions are those who would never have the wherewithal to try and use it as an excuse. And so people with mild illnesses are always responsible for their decisions, their moral decisions. So Mary doesn't, for your point of view, it doesn't matter whether she's crossed that boundary actually between normality and mild depression. She is responsible for her behavior. Because only somebody with very severe depression loses responsibility when they no longer understand right and wrong and their actions. So Frank, the other example I introduced at the beginning, Frank then in molesting his daughter with his Alzheimer's disease. So the problem with Frank is his memory was so bad he doesn't remember his wife has died. And of course his daughter looks quite like his wife used to look. And he's living in the past and he thinks he's young. And he thinks then, as he misperceives this woman, that this is his wife. He believes this is his wife. And so he acts towards her as he acted towards his wife, with sexual advances and so on. So yes, objectively, you might say he shouldn't be doing that. And of course, his daughter doesn't want him to do that, and it's still a problem to handle. But he doesn't understand what he's doing. He thinks what he's doing is perfectly right towards his wife. Except it's not his wife. Because he's mentally ill, he doesn't understand his actions and what they mean. But by and large, the vast majority of people with mental illnesses are responsible for their actions because you have to be really impaired to not be responsible for one's actions. I will stop there, noting the clock. I'm sorry, I'm almost out of time, and we are supposed to have questions. I think we will have more time in the next session, hopefully, for questions then. Thank you.